A black journalist just published the truth, ready to finally breathe after weeks of threats. But when he walks into his office, everything changes. A powerful man, furious at being exposed, moves to silence him without cause, publicly humiliates him, smears his name, and just 12 minutes later, he's fired on the spot. What happens next shocks everyone and sets off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you believe in the power of truth, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that matter. It was just another ordinary morning, or so he thought. It was the kind of morning that felt stretched too thin. The sky over Harlem caught between the first light of dawn and the weight of the night that had just passed. The streets were waking up slowly. Shopkeepers rolling up their metal grates. Bread trucks pulling in with their deliveries. A few early risers already waiting at the bus stop, their shoulders heavy with the day ahead. Ezekiel Carter had lived in Harlem all his life. But lately, it felt like the city was changing. Or maybe it was just him. He had been a schoolteacher once, before he realized that no matter how many books he placed in front of his students, the world outside was still writing the story for them. That morning, he stood on the corner of 125th and Lenox, a newspaper tucked under his arm, waiting for the bus to take him downtown. A simple trip, a daily routine, but in a city like this, even a routine could turn into something else. The bus pulled up, brakes hissing, doors swinging open. Ezekiel stepped up, dropping a few coins into the slot. The driver barely looked at him. White, middle-aged, with a name tag that read Sullivan. His eyes skimmed over Ezekiel the way a man looks at something that doesn't quite belong. Ezekiel took a seat near the middle. Not the front, not the back, right in that unspoken territory where a man like him was allowed. But not expected. A few stops later, the bus began to fill. A young white woman, Miss Eleanor Reed, stepped on, dressed in a pale blue skirt suit. Her blonde hair tucked neatly under a small hat. She carried herself the way certain women did, like the world had already made space for her before she even arrived. She glanced around, her lips pressing together when she saw the empty seat beside Ezekiel. For a moment, just a flicker of hesitation. Then, carefully, she lowered herself onto the seat. The bus rolled forward. Ezekiel kept his eyes on the newspaper. But he could feel it. The quiet discomfort, the slight shift of her body. Just enough to keep from brushing against him. And then, the moment broke. From a few rows ahead. A voice, sharp, deliberate. "You can take my seat, ma'am." It was a white man. Older, wearing a brown hat and a look that didn't ask, but demanded. Eleanor hesitated. Ezekiel turned the page of his newspaper. Slow. And then, almost apologetically, the woman stood up, moved forward, took the seat the man had offered. Ezekiel folded the newspaper in his lap, exhaling through his nose. The bus rattled along, but the moment lingered. It wasn't about a seat. It was never about a seat. The city never truly rested. But there were moments when it held its breath, when the streets were too quiet, and the weight of things unsaid pressed against the buildings, seeped into the pavement. Ezekiel Carter had always known how to read those moments, how to navigate them. That morning on the bus was one of them. A reminder, a lesson that didn't need to be spoken aloud, because it had been repeated so many times before. By the time Ezekiel stepped off the bus at 42nd Street, the sky had begun its slow climb toward noon, the heat rising in thick waves off the asphalt. He walked with purpose, past department stores with windows full of mannequins dressed in clothes he wasn't meant to wear, past restaurants where the waiters would hesitate before offering him a menu. At the end of the block stood Harrison and Boyle Publishing, a building with wide glass doors and a lobby that gleamed like something out of a dream. He had been here before, but each time, it felt like stepping into a world that wasn't entirely real. A world that had been built with men like him in mind only as an afterthought, if at all. He adjusted his tie and walked inside. The receptionist barely looked up as he approached. White, young, with the kind of face that hadn't yet been touched by time or struggle. Her fingers moved quickly across a typewriter, the rhythmic clack of the keys filling the air. He cleared his throat. She glanced up, her eyes flickering over him before settling back on the machine. Can I help you? Ezekiel Carter. I have an appointment with Mr. Boyle. A pause. Then, slowly, she reached for the phone, pressing it against her ear. A murmur of words he couldn't hear. A glance in his direction. A slight narrowing of the eyes. Finally, she set the receiver down. You can take a seat. Ezekiel nodded, but he didn't move. He had learned, a long time ago, that waiting wasn't always just waiting. Sometimes, it was a test, a silent way of asking, do you know your place? So he stayed where he was, standing, his hands clasped behind his back. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. The white men who came in after him were seen quickly, ushered through the doors, their laughter filling the room as they disappeared into offices lined with bookshelves and leather chairs. 20 minutes. The receptionist looked up again. Her lips pursed as if she had been hoping he would have given up by now. I said you can have a seat. He met her gaze, and for a moment, the air between them felt like something solid. Like something that could be bent but not broken. I prefer to stand. Another 5 minutes. Then, at last, a man in a dark suit stepped into the lobby. Mr. Boyle. He was tall, with the easy confidence of someone who had never had to explain himself. His eyes scanned the room, landing on Ezekiel with something that wasn't quite recognition. Then, a smile, forced, professional, but with just a hint of something else beneath it. Mr. Carter, he said, extending a hand. Apologies for the wait. Ezekiel shook his hand, firm but measured. Not a problem, he said. I'm used to waiting. Boyle hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then, he gestured toward the hallway. Shall we? Ezekiel nodded, and as he followed Boyle into the office, he couldn't help but wonder. How many doors did a man have to walk through before he was truly inside? The office smelled like old books and polished wood. The kind of place where important conversations were meant to be had. But only by certain people. Ezekiel Carter knew that before he had even stepped inside. He could feel it in the heavy silence. In the way the air itself seemed to push against him. Testing to see if he really belonged. Mr. Boyle motioned toward a chair across from his desk. It was deep brown leather. Its arms worn from years of men leaning forward. Closing deals. Signing contracts that would change the course of their lives. Ezekiel sat, but not fully. He stayed on the edge. His spine straight. His hands resting lightly on his thighs. A man who looked too comfortable in a space like this was often seen as arrogant. While a man who looked too uneasy was seen as weak. It was a fine line to walk. But one he had learned to balance on a long time ago. Boyle settled into his own chair with far less caution. He clasped his hands together, studying Ezekiel with the measured curiosity of someone inspecting a rare item before deciding its worth. I read your manuscript, Boyle said. It's powerful. Ezekiel nodded once, waiting. Boyle leaned back, tapping his fingers against the polished wood of the desk. The writing is sharp, no denying that, but the subject matter. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. It's heavy, very heavy. Ezekiel didn't respond. He wanted to see where this was going first. Boyle sighed, rubbing his jaw. Look, Carter, you're talented. That much is clear. But this story you've written. He picked up the manuscript from his desk, thumbing through the pages as if he were holding something fragile. Something dangerous. Quote. It's difficult. It's uncomfortable. Publishers aren't lining up to print something that makes people uneasy. People want stories that inspire. That uplift. He set the pages down, lacing his fingers together. And to be frank, stories about race, about struggle, well, they don't sell the way you might think they do. Ezekiel had heard this speech before. Not in these exact words. Maybe, but the message was always the same. Make it easier for them. Soften the truth. Give them something they can swallow without choking on it. What are you suggesting? Ezekiel asked, his voice even. Boyle smiled, as if relieved to finally get to the point. Tone it down. Make it more universal. The parts about racial violence. Maybe we scale those back. The ending. Does it have to be so? He searched for the word. Hopeless? Ezekiel let the silence stretch between them. Boyle sighed again. shaking his head as if he were doing Ezekiel a favor. I want to publish your book, he said finally. I do. But publishing is a business. And if we want this to reach as many people as possible, we have to be mindful. Ezekiel stared at him, at the man who held his future in his hands and had the audacity to act as if he were the one being reasonable. Mindful. That was a word white men liked to use when they were asking you to lie to yourself. When they were asking you to make things easier for them. Ezekiel leaned forward slightly, his hands still calm on his thighs. I understand, he said. Boyle's smile widened, mistaking Ezekiel's words for agreement. Ezekiel nodded toward the manuscript. And you understand that I wrote every word of that book deliberately. Boyle hesitated. I didn't make the story heavy. Mr. Boyle, Ezekiel continued, the world did that. I just put it on the page. Boyle's smile faltered. If you're asking me to make it easier for people to read, Ezekiel said, his voice quiet but firm. What you're really asking me to do is make it easier for them to ignore. Boyle opened his mouth, then closed it. He exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head again, this time not in sympathy but in frustration. You're a stubborn man, Carter. I've had to be, Ezekiel said. Boyle pressed his palms against the desk. Look, I'm offering you an opportunity. A real one. You make the changes. We get this published. And who knows, maybe in your next book, you can write exactly how you want to. But you have to get in the door first. Ezekiel's jaw tightened, but only for a moment. He thought of all the doors he had walked through just to get to this one. The ones he had been turned away from. The ones he had been forced to enter through the back. And now, here was another one, wide open. But at what cost? He inhaled slowly, considering. Then, finally, he met Boyle's eyes and said, no. The air in the office thickened. Boyle blinked. No? Ezekiel shook his head. If you want to publish the book, publish it as it is. If you don't, then don't. Boyle studied him, his fingers tapping once against the desk before he slowly stood. I'll think about it, he said finally, his voice cool, professional. Ezekiel stood as well. So will I, he replied. And then, without shaking hands, without another word, Ezekiel Carter turned and walked out of the office. He had spent his whole life waiting for doors to open. But maybe, just maybe, some doors weren't worth walking through at all. Ezekiel Carter walked home through the heavy dusk of Harlem, his mind circling the conversation with Boyle like a hawk tracing its prey. The night air was thick, humming with the electricity of a city that never truly rested. Cars honked in the distance. Jazz curled out of a second-story window. And the scent of fried fish and cigarettes drifted through the air. But none of it touched him. Not tonight. He had been here before. In this exact place. Staring down a choice that had already been made for him long before he ever set foot in Boyle's office. It wasn't just about the book. It was never just about the book. A few blocks from home, he stopped outside the corner store where Mr. Lewis was locking up for the night. The old man glanced up, his hands moving slow as he twisted the key in the rusted lock. Late night, Carter? Ezekiel nodded. Something like that. Mr. Lewis leaned against the doorframe, studying him. You look like a man carrying something too heavy for one person to hold. Ezekiel exhaled through his nose. A quiet laugh that didn't quite reach his chest. That obvious? Mr. Lewis grunted, wiping his hands on his apron. Everything is obvious when you know what to look for. Ezekiel shifted, feeling the weight of the manuscript in his bag. The weight of the truth Boyle had asked him to smooth over. They want me to change it, he said finally. Mr. Lewis nodded, unsurprised. They always do. Ezekiel glanced up, meeting his gaze. You ever wonder what would happen if we stopped letting them? The old man chuckled, deep and low. They'd get scared. A silence stretched between them. The kind of silence that said more than words ever could. Ezekiel tightened his grip on the strap of his bag. Good. He climbed the stairs to his apartment, exhaustion creeping into his bones. But there was no rest waiting for him inside. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, a cup of tea steaming in front of her. She looked up when he walked in, her sharp eyes catching the tension in his face before he could hide it. What happened? He dropped his bag onto the chair and rubbed his temples. Boyle wants me to change the book. Sarah leaned back, folding her arms across her chest. What does he want you to take out? Ezekiel scoffed. The truth. She nodded, as if she had expected nothing less. And what did you say? He looked at her then. At the woman who had never once asked him to make himself smaller. Never once told him to soften his voice for the sake of white comfort. I told him no. A small smile played at the corner of her lips. But there was something else in her eyes. Something heavy. What? He asked. Sarah hesitated. Are you sure? Ezekiel frowned. Of course I'm sure. She exhaled, looking down at her hands. It's just, she shook her head. I know why you're doing this. And I know you're right. But Ezekiel, we need this. His chest tightened. She wasn't wrong. The rent was due in 2 weeks. The gas bill sat unopened on the counter. And beyond that, there was something deeper, something more fragile. A dream, barely held together by hope. She reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. I believe in you. I do. But belief doesn't pay the bills. Ezekiel swallowed hard. So you think I should do it? Sarah's eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite name. I think you should do what you need to do. He nodded, but the truth sat bitter in his mouth. Because what he needed to do and what they needed to survive were not the same thing. The next morning, Ezekiel found himself standing outside Boyle's office once again. The weight of his decision pressed against his ribs. Heavy as stone. But before he could reach for the door, a voice cut through the air behind him. Mr. Carter. He turned. A woman stood there, dressed in a blue coat. Her dark eyes sharp and knowing. I read your manuscript, she said, stepping closer. The real version. Ezekiel tensed. And? She smiled. But it wasn't the kind of smile that softened things. It was the kind that sharpened them. I work with a different publisher. One that doesn't ask men like you to make themselves easier to swallow. His heart pounded. I'd like to talk, she said, holding out her hand. Ezekiel stared at it for a moment. At the doorway behind him. At the choice that had suddenly become his to make. And then, without hesitation, he shook her hand. Because some doors were never meant to be walked through. Some were meant to be kicked down. Ezekiel Carter had never been a man who backed down. That was what he told himself as he sat across from Miriam Davies in a cafe on the Lower East Side. The manuscript between them like a loaded gun. I won't lie to you, she said, stirring her coffee without looking up. Publishing this will come at a cost. Ezekiel exhaled slowly, his fingers drumming against the table. What kind of cost? Miriam finally met his gaze. Her dark eyes steady, the kind you already know too well. Outside, the city moved like an untamed beast. Cars honking, voices rising, the smell of exhaust thick in the air. Inside, it was quieter, but no less suffocating. Boyle will blackball you, she continued, once you say no to them. You don't get another chance. Not in their world. Ezekiel scoffed, shaking his head. Their world was never mine to begin with. Miriam tilted her head slightly. Then why were you standing outside his office yesterday? His jaw tightened. Because Sarah needed security. Because the gas bill was still unpaid. Because for all his conviction. For all his righteous anger. He still lived in a world that forced men like him to choose between truth and survival. Miriam leaned in, lowering her voice. You don't have to decide today. But know this. If you publish with us, we won't ask you to soften your words. We won't ask you to make it more comfortable for them. Ezekiel studied her, searching for the catch. Then what will you ask of me? She smiled slightly. Only that you are ready for what comes next. The trouble started before he even got home. At the newsstand on 125th Street, Mr. Lewis, who always knew things before anyone else did, was already shaking his head when he spotted Ezekiel. You got them folks angry, he muttered, folding a newspaper under his arm. Ezekiel frowned. What are you talking about? Mr. Lewis gave him a look. The kind old men reserved for young fools. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and handed it over. Ezekiel unfolded it slowly, his stomach twisting at the first few lines. Ezekiel Carter, radical Negro writer, refuses to work with respected publisher. Chooses controversy over integrity. His mouth went dry. He didn't need to read further. This wasn't just about the book. This was a warning. They're setting the stage. Mr. Lewis said. Make you look like a troublemaker before you even open your mouth. Ezekiel exhaled sharply, crumpling the paper in his fist. They think they can scare me. Mr. Lewis chuckled, a sound without humor. They don't need to scare you. Boy, they just need to make life harder. Ezekiel shoved the paper into his pocket and kept walking. But the words clung to him like a bad smell. That night, he sat at the kitchen table while Sarah read the article in silence. When she finally looked up, there was something unreadable in her expression. They're going to come for you, she said softly. Ezekiel set his jaw. They already have. Sarah leaned back, crossing her arms. And you're still going to do this? He hesitated, not because he was unsure, but because for the first time, he saw the weight of his choice in her eyes. This isn't just about you, she continued. It's about us. About what happens when they decide you're too much of a problem to ignore. Ezekiel ran a hand over his face. So what are you saying? She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. I don't know, Zeke. She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. I don't want to lose you. A silence stretched between them. Because they both knew what happened to men who spoke too loudly. To men who refused to bend. Ezekiel reached across the table, covering her hand with his. I hear you, he said. I do. Sarah studied him, her eyes searching for something. Perhaps an answer, perhaps a way out. But they both knew there wasn't one. Not in this America. The next morning, a brick came through their window. The sound of shattering glass sent Ezekiel and Sarah bolting upright in bed. Sarah was the first to move, her breath sharp with panic. Zeke, quote. I got it. He threw on a shirt and rushed to the front room, stepping carefully over the broken glass. The brick lay among the shards, a piece of paper tied around it with twine. His hands were steady as he picked it up. As he unraveled the note. Go back to where you belong. Ezekiel stared at the words. His heartbeat steady but slow. Sarah stood behind him, her breath uneven. That's what I was afraid of. He turned, meeting her gaze. I know. She swallowed. So what now? Ezekiel looked down at the note. Then at the shattered glass. Then at the Harlem streets stretching endlessly beyond their broken window. Then, finally, at his manuscript. He picked it up, gripping it tightly in his hands. Now, there was no choice left to make. Now, there was only the fight. Ezekiel Carter stood in front of his shattered window and understood, perhaps for the first time, that he was at war. It was not the kind of war that the history books spoke of. The kind with uniforms, soldiers, and parades. No, this was a quieter, more insidious war. A war of silence, of locked doors, of conversations held just out of earshot. A war waged in back rooms, in board meetings, in newspaper columns where faceless men shaped the world in their own image. And tonight, it was a war fought with bricks through windows. Sarah swept up the last of the glass. Her movements careful, deliberate. When she finally spoke, her voice was tight. We can't stay here. Ezekiel didn't answer. She turned to him, exasperated. Zeke. I hear you. Then say something. He looked at her, really looked at her, at the exhaustion in her eyes, at the way her hands trembled slightly even as she tried to steady herself. They want us afraid, he said finally. Sarah let out a hollow laugh. Well, congratulations. They succeeded. Ezekiel shook his head. No, they didn't. He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. They just reminded me what this fight costs. Sarah closed her eyes for a long moment. I don't want you to be a martyr. Ezekiel reached for her hand, gripping it tightly. I don't intend to be. She studied him for a moment, then sighed. Then what happens now? He looked down at the crumpled note in his other hand. Go back to where you belong. I write, he said simply, and I publish. The next day, Ezekiel walked into the New York Times office. The receptionist barely looked up. Do you have an appointment? No, he said, but I have a story. That got her attention. She eyed him warily, her gaze flickering to his manuscript. You'll have to submit that through proper channels. Ezekiel nodded. I understand. Then, without breaking eye contact, He dropped the stack of papers on the counter. Make sure it gets to someone who isn't afraid of the truth. He turned and walked out before she could protest. Outside, the city pulsed around him. Car horns blaring, voices rising, the endless movement of people who lived and died in the margins of America's promise. Ezekiel had no illusions about what would happen next. He knew that the moment his words saw print, the real trouble would begin. It took 2 days for the first call to come. It came from a man who never introduced himself but who spoke with the slow, practiced certainty of someone who had never heard the word no in his life. You've made a mistake, Mr. Carter. Ezekiel leaned back in his chair. Have I? The man chuckled, a low, humorless sound. You don't understand the game you're playing. No, Ezekiel said. I understand it just fine. A pause. Then, you have a family, don't you? Ezekiel's grip on the phone tightened. Leave them out of this. That's up to you. Click. The dial tone hummed in Ezekiel's ear. That night, Sarah woke to find Ezekiel sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his typewriter. She said nothing at first. Just walked over, placed a hand on his shoulder. I know what they said, she murmured. Ezekiel closed his eyes briefly. They don't scare me. Sarah sat across from him, searching his face. Then why haven't you touched the keys? He hesitated, not because he was afraid, but because deep down, he knew the truth. There was no way out of this that didn't end in blood. Sarah reached for his hand. Then write, she whispered. Write like it matters. The article ran the next morning. The War They Don't Want You to See, by Ezekiel Carter. It spread like wildfire. By noon, his phone wouldn't stop ringing. Some calls were from friends, from allies, from strangers who saw his words and recognized their own lives in them. Others were not so kind. By evening, the threats were more than just phone calls. A group of men gathered outside his building, their voices low and edged with something darker than anger. A police car passed but didn't stop. Ezekiel stood at the window, watching. Sarah came up beside him. How does it feel? She asked softly. He exhaled, like standing in the eye of a storm. Sarah nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. So what do we do? Ezekiel turned to her, his jaw set. We stand. Because what else was there to do? Because he had already chosen his side. Because if he ran now, he'd be running for the rest of his life. Outside, the men lingered, waiting. Ezekiel Carter sat back down at his typewriter, rolled in a fresh sheet of paper, and started to write. The first time Ezekiel Carter saw the inside of a jail cell, he was 17 years old. The second time, he was 42. The difference was that, at 17, he had been a boy caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. This time, he had walked into it with his eyes wide open. It had started with a knock. Not the polite kind. Not the kind that waited. It was the kind of knock that told you the door was going to open whether you answered it or not. Sarah froze, her hand tightening around her coffee cup. Don't. Ezekiel kissed her forehead, then walked to the door. The man on the other side wore a badge and a smirk. And in his eyes was the cold certainty of someone who had never had to answer for his actions. Mr. Carter, the officer drawled, we have a warrant. Ezekiel barely glanced at the paper. He had seen enough of them in his life to know they meant nothing. What's the charge? The smirk widened, inciting unrest. Sarah was already by his side. This is ridiculous. The officer shrugged. Tell it to the judge. Ezekiel nodded once, then held out his wrists. Seek. Sarah whispered. It's all right, he murmured, and then the cold steel of the cuffs closed around his wrists. They didn't put him in with the drunks or the pickpockets. They put him in a cell alone. The walls were gray. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and metal. Ezekiel sat on the cot and waited. Because he knew what this was. It was not about crime. It was not about law. It was about making an example. And yet, as he sat there, listening to the slow, rhythmic hum of the city beyond those walls, he wondered how many men had sat in this very spot before him. How many men had waited, just as he was waiting. And how many of them had never walked out. The first visitor came after 3 hours. A lawyer. Not one he recognized. Not one he trusted. You're a difficult man, Mr. Carter. Ezekiel leaned back against the cold stone wall. So they tell me. The lawyer smirked. They're offering you a deal. Ezekiel waited. Recant your article. Issue a statement saying you exaggerated your claims. And if I don't? The smirk vanished. Then you rot here. Ezekiel exhaled slowly. Then, finally, he smiled. Then I rot. The second visitor came after 6 hours. This one he did recognize. Miriam Johnson had been in the fight longer than he had. She was old enough to have seen men like him rise and fall. She took one look at him through the bars and shook her head. Did you have to be so damn stubborn? Ezekiel chuckled. Would you respect me if I wasn't? Miriam sighed. The paper's standing by you. But you've got enemies, Seek. I know. You don't seem worried. Ezekiel tilted his head. Worry won't change the outcome. Miriam studied him for a long time. Then, finally, she leaned forward, voice low. There are two kinds of men in this world. The ones who survive, and the ones who make history. Ezekiel met her gaze. And which one am I? Miriam smiled. That depends on how this story ends. They kept him there for 3 days. 3 days of silence. 3 days of waiting. And then, on the morning of the 4th, the door opened. You're free to go, the guard muttered. Ezekiel didn't move. Why? The guard didn't answer. But when Ezekiel stepped out of the station, he saw the reason. They were waiting for him. Not the police. Not the men in suits. The people. Hundreds of them. Holding signs with his name. Holding copies of his article. Holding each other. And in the center of it all, standing tall and proud, was Sarah. Ezekiel breathed in the air. The city. The fight. And then he walked toward them. Because the war wasn't over. Not yet. The night Ezekiel Carter walked out of jail, the city was waiting for him. The crowd stretched down the block. Faces lit by streetlights and the glow of cell phones. Some were young, fists raised. Others were old, their eyes heavy with memories of fights they had fought before. Sarah was at the front. Her arms crossed. Her mouth set in a firm line. They wanted you silenced, she murmured as he reached her side. Ezekiel exhaled slowly. Then they should have done better. The next morning, the newspaper's front page carried 2 stories. The first was about his arrest. The second was about the riot that never happened. Because that was the real story. Wasn't it? They had put him behind bars expecting chaos. Expecting shattered windows and burning cars. Expecting the city to react the way they had always been told it would. But the people had done something far more dangerous. They had stood still. They had gathered, shoulder to shoulder, silent but unmovable. They had made it clear, in a way that could not be ignored, that they would not go home until their voices were heard. And in the offices where men in suits made decisions, that had been more terrifying than any riot could have been. Ezekiel sat at his desk, the weight of the moment pressing against his ribs. His article had been about a man who had been walking home from work when the police decided he looked suspicious. A man who had been thrown to the ground, pressed beneath the knee, called a threat, and then left broken in the street. The man had survived, but barely. Ezekiel had written about it. Not as a reporter, but as a witness. And for that, they had tried to break him. Now, he had a choice. He could move carefully. He could soften his words. He could make it easier for them to swallow. Or he could tell the truth. He picked up his pen. It was just past midnight when the phone rang. Ezekiel answered without hesitation. Carter. Seek. Miriam's voice was sharp. They're coming for you again. His grip tightened on the receiver. Who? The same people who locked you up. The same people who are reading your new piece right now. Ezekiel glanced at the draft sitting on his desk. They're scared. Miriam continued. And scared men do dangerous things. Ezekiel nodded, even though she couldn't see him. I'll be careful, he said. Miriam's sigh crackled through the line. No, you won't. And then she hung up. The first threat came in the form of a letter. It was slid under his door in the dead of night. The words scrawled in a shaking, angry hand. You don't know when to quit. Ezekiel burned it without a second glance. The second came as a shadow trailing him through the city. A man in a gray suit. A man who never spoke. Never touched him. Never even looked him in the eye. But was always there. Ezekiel met his gaze once. On the subway. Just as the doors slid shut, the man smiled. And that was worse than any threat could have been. You need to leave town, Sarah told him. Ezekiel leaned against the counter, watching as she packed a suitcase with angry, efficient movements. I'm not running, he said. You're not running, she snapped. You're surviving. Ezekiel exhaled. Sarah, quote. No, she cut him off. Not this time. Her hands stilled over the suitcase. Her breath shaky. I lost my father to this fight. She whispered. I lost my brother. I am not losing you too. Ezekiel swallowed hard. And then, slowly, he reached out and took her hands in his. They want us to believe this fight only ends in blood. He murmured, that the only two choices are silence or death. Sarah's fingers tightened around his. But I am telling our story, he said, and that means they don't get to decide how it ends. At dawn, he walked out of their apartment and into the city. The same city that had cheered for him when he was released. The same city that had swallowed men whole. His article was printed that morning. By noon, it was already being pulled from newsstands. By sunset, it was online, passed from hand to hand, screen to screen. By midnight, it was too late to stop. The truth was out, and when the knock came at the door, he was ready. Ezekiel Carter was arrested for the second time at 3:14 a.m. But this time, they weren't just taking him. This time, the city followed. By the time the sun rose, the streets were full, not just with the young, whose rage had always been expected, but with the old, with the ones who remembered, with the ones who had marched before, and who would march again. The police were waiting, lined up in riot gear, their hands twitching near their weapons. And still, the people came. They came with signs. They came with voices. They came with fire in their hearts and history in their hands. And this time, Ezekiel knew, they would not leave. Not until the walls that held them had crumbled to dust. Not until the fire had burned itself into the sky. Not until the world understood. They would never be silent again.